The Oracle and the Mountains. 1. The boy found the Oracle and it almost destroyed him. Some thin instinct brought the gunslinger up from sleep to the velvet darkness which had fallen on them at dusk. That had been when he and Jake reached a grassy, nearly level oasis above the first rise of tumbled foothills. Even on the hard scrabble below, where they had toiled and fought for every foot in the killer sun, they had been able to hear the sound of crickets rubbing their legs seductively together in the perpetual green of willow groves above them. The gunslinger remained calm in his mind, and the boy had kept up at least the pretense of a facade, and they had made the gunslinger proud. But Jake hadn't been able to hide the wildness in his eyes. The eyes of a horse scenting water and held back from the bolting only by the tenuous chain of its master's mind, like a horse at the point where only understanding, not the spur, could hold it in steady. The gunslinger could gouge the need in Jake by the madness the sounds of the crickets bred in his own body. His arms seemed to seek out shale to scrape on, and his knees seemed to beg to be ripped in tiny, maddening, salty gashes. The sun trampled them all the way, even when it turned to a swollen, feverish red with sunset. It shone perversely through the knife cut in the hills off to their left, blinding them and making every teardrop of sweat into a prism of pain. Then there was sawgrass. At first, only yellow scrub, clinging with gruesome vitality to the bleak soil where the last of the runoff reached. Further up, there was witchgrass, first sparse, then green and rank, then the sweet smell of real grass, mixed with timothy and shaded by the first of the dwarfed firs. There the gunslinger saw an arc of brown moving in the shadows. He drew, fired, and felled the rabbit all before Jake could begin to cry out in surprise. A moment later, he had reholstered the gun. "Here," the gunslinger said. Up ahead, the grass deepened into a jungle of green willows that was shocking after parched sterility of the endless heartpan. There would be a spring, perhaps several of them, and it would be even cooler. But it would be better out here in the open. The boy had pushed every step he could push, and there might be sucker bats in the deeper shadows of the grove. The bats might break the boy's sleep, no matter how deep it was, and if they were vampires, neither of them might awaken. At least, not in this world. The boy said, "I'll get some wood." The gunslinger smiled. "No, you won't. Sit yourself, Jake." Whose phrase had that been? Some woman? Susan? He could not remember. Time's the thief of memory. That one he knew. That one had been Vinay's. The boy sat. When the gunslinger got back, Jake was asleep in the grass. A large praying mantis was performing absolutions on the spring stem of the kid's cowlick. The gunslinger snorted laughter, the first in God knew how long, and set the fire and went after water. The willow jungle was deeper than he had suspected, and confusing in the falling light. But he had found a spring, richly guarded by frogs and peepers. He filled one of their water skins and paused. The sound that filled the night awoke an uneasy sensuality in him, a feeling that not even Allie, the woman he had bedded with in Tull, had been able to bring out. Too much of his time with Allie had been business. He chalked it up to the sudden blinding change from the desert. After all those miles of bleak heartpan, the softness of the dark seemed nearly decadent. He returned to the camp and skinned the rabbit while water boiled over the fire. Mixed with the last of the canned veg, the rabbit made an excellent stew. He woke Jake and watched him as he ate, blearily but ravenous. "We stay here tomorrow," the gunslinger said. "But the man you're after, that priest—" "He's no priest. And don't worry, he'll keep." "How do you know that?" The gunslinger could only shake his head. The intuition was strong in him, but it was not a good intuition. After the meal, he rinsed the cans from which they had eaten, marveling again at his own water extravagance. And when he turned around, Jake was asleep again. The gunslinger now felt the familiar rising and falling in his chest that he could only identify with Cuthbert. Cuthbert had been Roland's own age, but he had seemed so much younger. His cigarette dropped towards the grass, and he tossed it into the fire. He looked at it, the clear yellow burn, so different, so much cleaner from the way the devil grass burned. The air was so wonderfully cool, and he lay down with his back to the fire. Far away, through the gash that led the way into the mountains, he heard the thick mouth of the perpetual thunder. He slept and dreamed. 2. Susan Delgado, his beloved, was dying before his eyes. He watched, his arms held by 2 villagers on each side, his neck dog-caught in a huge rusty iron collar. This wasn't the way that happened. He hadn't been there, but dreams had their own logic, didn't they? She was dying. He could smell her burning hair, could hear their cries of "Char you three!" and he could see the color of his own madness. Susan, lovely girl at the window, horseman's daughter. How she had flown across the drop, her shadow, that of a horse and a girl merged, a fabulous creature out of an old story, something wild and free. How they had flown together in the corn. Now they were flinging corn husks at her, and the husks caught fire even before they caught in her hair. "Char you tree! Char you tree!" they cried. These enemies of light and love, and somewhere the witch was cackling. Rhea, the witch's name had been, and Susan was turning black in the flames, her skin cracking open, and what was she calling? "The boy!" she screamed. "Roland, the boy!" He whirled, pulling his captors with him. The collar ripped off his neck, and he heard the hitching, strangled sounds that were coming from his own throat. There was a sickish, sweet smell of barbecuing meat on the air. The boy was looking down at him from the window high above the funeral pyre. The same window where Susan, who had taught him to be a man, had once sat and sung the old songs, "Hey Jude," and "Ease on down the road," and "Careless Love." He looked out from the window like a statue of an alabaster saint in a cathedral. His eyes were marble. A spike had been driven through Jake's forehead. The gunslinger felt the strangling, ripping scream that signaled the beginning of his lunacy, pulled up from the bottom of his belly. 3. Roland grunted a cry as he felt the fire singe him. He sat bolt upright in the dark, and still feeling the dream of mages around him, strangling him like the collar he had worn. In his twistings and turnings he had thrown one of his hand against the dying coals of the fire. He had put the hand to his face, feeling the dream flee, leaving only the stark picture of Jake, plaster white, a saint for demons. He glared around the mystic darkness and the willow grove, both guns out and ready. His eyes were red loopholes in the last glow from the fire. Jake. The gunslinger was up and around. The bitter circle of the moon had risen, and he could follow the boy's track in the dew. He ducked under the first of the willows, splashed through the spring, and legged up the far bank, skidding into the dampness. Even now his body could relish it. Willow white slapped at his face. The trees were thicker here, and the moon was blotted out. Tree trunks rose in the lurching shadows. The grass, now knee-high, caressed him, as if pleading with him to slow down, to enjoy the cool, to enjoy the life. Half-rotted dead branches reached for his shins, his cojones. He paused after a moment, lifting his head and scenting at the air. A ghost of a breeze helped him. The boy did not smell good. Of course, neither of them did. The gunslinger's nostrils flared like those of an ape. The younger, lighter odor of the boy's sweat was faint, oily, unmistakable. He crashed over a deadfall of grass and bramble and downed branches. He sprinted through the tunnel of overhanging willow and sumac. Most struck his shoulders like flabby corpse hands. Some clung in sighing gray tendrils. He clawed through a last barricade of willows and came to a clearing that looked up at the stars and at the highest peak of the range, gleaming skull-white at impossible altitude. There was a ring of black, standing stones which looked like some sort of surreal animal trap in the moonlight. In the center was a table of stone, an altar, very old, rising out of the ground on a thick arm of basalt. The boy stood before it, trembling back and forth. His hands shook at his side as if infused with static electricity. The gunslinger called his name sharply, and Jake responded with an inarticulate sound of negation. The faint smear of face, almost hidden by the boy's left shoulder, looked both terrified and exalted. There was something else. The gunslinger stepped inside the ring, and Jake screamed, recoiling and throwing his arms up. Now his face could be seen clearly. The gunslingers read fear and terror at war with some excruciating pleasure. The gunslinger felt it touch him, the spirit of the oracle, the succubus. His loins were suddenly filled with light, a light that was soft yet hard. He felt his head twisting, his tongue thickening and becoming sensitive to even the spittle that coated it. He didn't think about what he was doing when he pulled the half-rotted jawbone from the pocket where he had carried it since he found it in the lair of the speaking demon at the way station. He didn't think, but it had never frightened him to operate on pure instinct. That had ever been the best and truest place for him. He held the jawbone's frozen, prehistoric grin up before his eyes, holding his other arm out stiffly. First and last fingers poked out at the ancient forked sign, the ward against the evil eye. The current of sensuality was whipped away from him like a drape. Jake screamed again. The gunslinger walked to him and held the jawbone in front of Jake's wearing eyes. "See this, Jake! See it very well!" What came in response was a wet sound of agony. The boy tried to pull his gaze away, could not. For a moment it seemed that he might be pulled apart, mentally if not physically. Then, suddenly, both eyes rolled up to the whites. Jake collapsed. His body struck the earth limply, one hand almost touching the squat basalt arm that supported the altar. The gunslinger dropped to one knee and picked him up. He was amazingly light, as dehydrated as November leaf from their long walk through the desert. Around him, Roland could feel the presence that dwelt in the circle of stones, wearying with a jealous anger. Its pride was being taken away from it. Once the gunslinger passed out of the circle, the sense of frustrated jealousy faded quickly. He carried Jake back to their camp. By the time they had got there, the boy's twitching unconscious body had become deep sleep. The gunslinger paused for a moment above the grey ruin of the fire. The moonlight on Jake's face reminded him again of a church saint, alabaster purity all unknown. He hugged the kid and put a dry kiss on his cheek, knowing that he loved him. Well, maybe that wasn't quite right. Maybe the truth was that he had loved the kid from the moment he first saw him, as he did Susan Delgado, and was only now allowing himself to recognize that fact, for it was a fact. And it seemed that he could almost feel the laughter from the man in black, someplace far above them. 4. Jake calling him. That was how the gunslinger awoke. He tied Jake firmly to one of the tough bushes that grew nearby, and the boy was hungry and upset. By the sun, it was almost 9:30. "Why'd you tie me up?" Jake asked indignantly, as the gunslinger loosened the thick knots in the blanket. "I wasn't going to run away." "You did run away," the gunslinger said, and an expression on Jake's face made him smile. "I had to go out there and get you. You were sleepwalking." "I was?" Jake looked at him suspiciously. "I never did anything like that The gunslinger suddenly produced a jawbone and held it in front of Jake's face. Jake flicked away from him, grimacing and raising his arm. "See?" Jake nodded, bewildered. "What happened?" "We don't have time to palaver now. I have to go off for a while. I may be gone the whole day, so listen to me, boy. It's important. If sunset comes and I'm not back, Fear flashed on Jake's face. "You're leaving me?" The gunslinger only looked at him. "No," Jake said after a moment. "I guess if you were going to leave me, you would already have done that." "That's using your head. Now listen, and hear me very well. I want you to stay here while I'm gone. Right here in this camp. Don't stray, even if it seems like the best idea in the world. And if you feel strange, funny in any way, you pick up this bone and hold it in your hands." Hate and disgust crossed Jake's face, mixed with bewilderment. "I couldn't. I just couldn't." "You can. You may have to, especially after midday. It's important. You may feel pukey or headachy when you first lay hold of it, but that'll pass. Do you understand?" "Yes." "And will you do as I say?" "Yes." "But why do you have to go away?" Jake burst out. "I just do." The gunslinger caught another fascinating glimpse of the steel that lay under the boy's surface, as enigmatic as the story he had told about coming from a city where the buildings were so tall you could actually scrape the sky. It wasn't Cuthbert the boy reminded him of, so much so as his other close friend, Elaine. Elaine had been quiet, in no way prone to Bert's grandstanding quackery, and had been dependable and afraid of nothing. "All right," Jake said. The gunslinger laid the jawbone carefully on the ground next to the ruins of the fire, where it grinned up through the grass like some eroded fossil that had seen the light of day after a night of 5,000 years. Jake wouldn't look at it. His face was pale and miserable. The gunslinger wondered if it would profit them for him to put the boy asleep and question him, then decided there would be little to gain. He knew well enough that the spirit of the stone circle was surely a demon, and very likely an oracle as well. A demon with no shape, only a kind of unformed sexual glare with the eye of prophecy. He wondered briefly if it might not be the soul of Sylvia Pittenson, the giant woman whose religious hucker-steering had led to the final showdown in Tull. But no, not her. The stones in the circle was ancient. Sylvia Pittston was a jilly-come-lately compared to the thing that made its den here. It was old and sly. But the gunslinger knew the forms of speaking quite well and did not think the boy would have to use the jawbone mojo. The voice and mind of the oracle would be more than occupied with him. The gunslinger needed to know things, in spite of the risk, and the risk was high. Yet for both Jake and himself, he needed desperately to know. The gunslinger opened his tobacco poke and pawned through it, pushing the dry strands of leaf aside until he came to a minuscule object wrapped in a fragment of white paper. He rolled it between fingers that would all too soon be gone, and looked absently at the sky. Then he unwrapped it and held the contents, a tiny white pill with edges that had been much worn with traveling, in his hand. Jake looked at it curiously. "What's that?" The gunslinger uttered a short laugh. "The story Court used to tell us, that the old gods pissed over the desert and made mescaline." Jake only looked puzzled. "This is a drug," the gunslinger said, "but not one that puts you to sleep. One that wakes you up all the way for a little while." "Like LSD?" The boy agreed instantly, and then looked puzzled. "What's that?" "I don't know," Jake said. "It just popped out. I think it came from, before." The gunslinger nodded, but was doubtful. He had never heard of mescaline referred to as LSD, not even in Martin's old books. "Will it hurt you?" Jake asked. "It has never," the gunslinger said, conscious of the evasion. "I don't like it." "Never mind." The gunslinger squatted in front of the water skin, took a mouthful, and swallowed the pill. As always, he felt an immediate reaction in his mouth. It seemed overloaded with saliva. He sat down before the dead fire. "When does something happen to you?" Jake asked. "Not for a little while. Be quiet." So, Jake was quiet, watching with open suspicion as the gunslinger went calmly about the ritual of cleaning his guns. He reholstered them and said, "Your shirt, Jake. Take it off and give it to me." Jake pulled his faded shirt reluctantly over his head, revealing the skinny stack of his ribs, and gave it to Roland. The gunslinger produced a needle that had been threaded into the side seam of his jeans, and thread from an empty cartridge loop in his gun belt. He began to sew up a long rip in one of the sleeves of the boy's shirt. He finished it and handed the shirt back. He felt the mess begin to take hold. There was a tightening in his stomach and a feeling that all the muscles in his body were being cranked up a notch. "I have to go," he said, getting up. "It's time." The boy half rose, his face a shadow of concern, and then settled back. "Be careful," he said. "Please." "Remember the jawbone," the gunslinger said. He put his hand on Jake's head and went by and tousled the corn-colored hair. The gesture startled him into a short laugh. Jake watched after him with a troubled smile until he was gone into the willow jungle. Thank you guys for sitting down with another part of reading The Gunslinger, and just like yesterday, hopefully we'll see you tomorrow with another part. We'll continue with part 5. Long days and pleasant nights to you.